thank you for the introduction. You'll notice that the title is different. I thought this was catchier. Yeah, so my research is on the garment sector, I looked over the slides this morning and realized it's quite Marx quote heavy, but then I realized we're at JNU, which is, I'm sure won't be frowned upon. So without further ado, I'll just kick it off. Okay, so the research takes a practical research approach, not just simply to interpret the world, but to see it, to try and actually impact it and change it. There seems to be a weird noise coming out of the computer, but yeah. Anyways, sorry. So take a scholar-activist approach, and that we try to understand and develop knowledge through workers themselves, through what Gramsci called organic intellectuals, and try to understand knowledge in that way, in the most efficacious way, by actually taking their own words rather than simply imposing our own. That's more of a philosophy. I hope I've accomplished that. But it's also towards a sort of Althusserian theoretical practice, which takes what people have to say and then tries to produce knowledge that will be helpful for workers and emancipatory struggles themselves. So my research involved being an organizer in a number of campaigns between 2012 and 2013 in and around Bangalore, and then also as an activist in the international campaign of UUN striking workers in South China, and those are the two sort of comparisons I'll be making. The theory is based on the idea that, yes, all struggles, post-industrial struggles are based on the antagonisms between workers. Not all struggles, but the industrial struggles are actually not what postmodernists would see a blurring of class lines, but actually that we're seeing, especially in the manufacturing sector, the labor-intensive manufacturing sector, the sharpening of those antagonisms. And also takes into account Mario Tronti and some of the opereists, the Italian opereists, who believed, based on Marx's notion, that the actions of capital are shaped and circumscribed by the subjective agency of workers. And that's the kind of analysis that it takes. And this has been expanded on by geographers like Andy Herod, Beverly Silver, and David Harvey. But I'd also like to say that there's contingency in theory, that this isn't some dogmatic approach, but that there's obviously a number of confounding variables that are involved in the emergence of theory. Oh, for some reason it's moving forward without my pressing anything. Sorry. So I approached the global clothing commodity chain. In the pre-1970s, 1980s, most of the garment sector, the labor in the garment sector, was in the global north. Obviously, that's not considering the entire supply chain. Obviously, you're dealing with super exploitation through imperialism, where they're extracting raw materials from the global south. But in terms of the labor, the ready-made garment section, that was concentrated in cities like Lower Manhattan, where the word sweatshop was formed, from largely Jewish immigrant workers who were exploited at a great level in Lower Manhattan, but also you saw a disconnection. One of the first industries where you see a disconnection between, a disintegration between where it's produced and where it's sold. So what is now called outsourcing, but back then it was called the jobber contractor system. And this starts changing during what Harvey and others have called a spatial fix, but a relocation of capital, what people have called globalization, away from the global north to the global south, in order to I mean, obviously, there's a lot of theories around this, but to absorb the crisis of profitability for capital. And so but the garment sector remains largely inoculated and immune from kind of technological fixes because you don't have the same level of capacity in terms of capital. Because buyers in the global supply chain historically have always been the deciders, you've never had the amount of capital necessary for economic upgrading and for sort of R&D that's involved in sort of expanding. So this sector has been what Gary Jaffe has called buyer-driven. So in the global supply chain, buyers, so retailers and brands like Nike and Adidas or being brands, Walmart being a retailer, are the primary deciders in the supply chain. So they can go around the world, and here's an example of a supply chain from the cotton field to the retail rack, and can effectively choose the lowest labor standards and reaping the highest profits at the top of the supply chain. And what this has left suppliers around the world powerless, but also obviously the workers powerless to have any kind of real negotiating power in their workplace. And they are also not able to make demands on their direct employer because the employer themselves aren't really driving the supply chain. When workers organize historically in globalized garment sector, what you've seen is brands cut and run, and factories either shut down or lose orders rapidly and are downsized dramatically. So now on to the specific case studies. Yueyuan is a company, publicly traded company, part of Pochen. It's the largest manufacturer of shoes, casual shoes and sports shoes in the world. Estimated 300,000 workers, and you've seen an exponential expansion in their and growth across the supply chain. So in 2001, they were producing 70 million shoes. By 2006, that went up to 200 million. By 2013, that's 313 million. And Nike is by far the largest purchaser of shoes from Yueyuan at 15 to 30%. But obviously, these are just estimates. And most of the production is in southern China, but there seems to be a somewhat shift in ancillary production in that, and I'll get to that in a minute. You've seen an expansion across the supply chain. So again, they're expanding to textiles, they're expanding to logistics, warehousing, they're expanding to even retail internally within China with their own brands. And then you're seeing economies of what Saskia Sassen calls economies of agglomeration, right? Where you have huge capacity building, which provides the kind of economies of scale that is more profitable to companies like Adidas and Nike, the brands. And so this is a shift in specific specialized production. You're seeing a shift towards greater capacity at the supplier end. So, quasi-monopoly capital, you could say, but specifically for specialized production, footwear being one of those, and greater ability for these companies to then have economic upgrading, technological upgrading. And Nike, in a recent report, said that Yueyuan was a key partner and what workers historically called a backbone shop. What these brands can really, their profits would be undermined severely were it not for these shops. So this is contrary to the Jerife thesis. The Yueyuan strike, I use collective bargaining by riot. This is a quote, what Eric Hobsbawm, the English historian, says is a form of collective bargaining when you don't, and Gay Seidman and others have talked about it in terms of social movement unionism, where there isn't the kinds of regulation where, again, that labor movements are regulated and shaped by those and mediated by that kind of mature systems of industrial relations. And so in order to collectively bargain, workers effectively go on strikes and riots, and that's the sort of first call. And it began in Guangdong province in April of 2014. A retired worker found that his retirement check was much less than what he'd paid for it, what he'd paid into it. He informed a number of workers at Guangdong where he'd worked. Those workers, the sort of word spread, and then a strike ensued. It was the largest strike in recent memory. I mean, large, again, is obviously a difficult term to use. In terms of numbers, that's definitely a defensible claim, but I think in terms of capital, it becomes a bit more tricky. 50,000 workers went on strike for almost 2 weeks, and they were forced back to work by, in my interviews and in news reports, by what workers said was by the authorities. They were forced back into work. And Yueyuan lost $26 million during that point, and then agreed to give social insurance from May 2014 onwards, but to the disappointment of workers, that wasn't applied retroactively. The second case study is Arvind. Many of you may have heard of Arvind Limited. It's based in India, but it's the fourth largest producer of denim, and it's the largest exporter of denim in India, and the world's fourth largest producer in denim. Again, a specialized production. So it's not garments writ large, but it's actually specialized, which means that it's more conducive to capital intensity because it does take a kind of quite a bit of capital intensity to produce denim and jeans, etc. So they're part of they were quite a key figure in the denim revolution in the 1980s in India. And they originally began as a textile manufacturer, but then they expanded to garment production, warehousing, and now retail. And they have their own retail. And they've created sort of supplier networks, supply chain networks for a number of companies in South Asia, within South Asia, but obviously transnational brands, including Tommy Hilfiger, PVH, that's Philip Van Heusen, the largest clothing producer in the world, or shirt producer in the world. And again, recently, PVH identified Arvind as a partner supplier, which is actually an important distinction, which is a recognition by transnational capital that in the labor-intensive production that they're no longer the only deciders in the supply chain. Profits are definitely are contingent on specific large supplier-end companies. The Arvind campaign is quite a bit different, and it's kind of indicative of the kind of industrial relations regime that you have and the differences between China and India. September 2012, number of workers at a 110-worker warehouse, distribution site, outside Bangalore in a town called Ramnagara, were sort of systematically harassed and had been for a while, and they decided to join the Garment and Textile Workers Union. There was about 100%, almost 100% union density, which is unheard of, and a series of workplace actions. When I visited there, the first time I visited there, I arrived at the factory and there were people who had been beaten, husbands of workers being taken to the hospital and to the police station to report it. And you saw that a number of Arvind sites had small workplace actions almost in solidarity with this warehouse. Because obviously there's a number of Arvind producers going through this warehouse because this warehouse, even though it's 110 workers, it's a high capacity warehouse. Ultimately, and then you saw a global, just like in UUN, you saw a global campaign at a number of PVH sort of retail shops. Well, they're not retail shops. Obviously, they're contracted retail, but still. And then the result was that dismissed workers were rehired. Sexual harassment committee was formed, but I mean, that's quite, again, workers were very disappointed. So the findings. The main findings is that workers are now able, in specialized production, are able to make demands on employers in specialized garment and footwear production. So again, denim, etc., socks, hats. And brands are not capable to cut, and oh my God, my time's almost running out, cut and run at the same level as they once were, but they still can cut and run from other sectors, right? Large producers of clothing, but not specialized. The large suppliers translates into greater number of worker actions across employees. So what you see is, from Guangdong, from Ramnagara, a number of actions, because now, whereas before there were smaller capitals everywhere, an expansion and absorption and acquisition of concentrated capital means that now workers can attack at various points in the supply chain. And greater value capture means greater negotiating power for workers. So now, you saw 26 million they were able to lose in UUN. That means that's money for greater profit sharing and negotiating power for workers, whereas historically that didn't happen. And greater consumer power because you saw a number of actions at a number of points of consumption in the global south at both points of production and points of consumption, whereas historically those points of retail didn't actually exist. I mean, I'm talking 20 years and beyond. A twilight of a spatial fix. I'm going to zip past this. Essentially the argument that what you're seeing is a shift outside of South China, which is changing the relationship between labor and capital, and they're trying to find other fixes. The garment sector for the last 100 years has relied on its ability to relocate to other areas, the spatial fix. So now it's shifting, I would argue, towards a sort of organizational fix in specific sectors. And so you're seeing an enlargement of supplier and capital, a concentration of specialized capital. Here's a number of companies that are similar to Arvind and UUN, Pochen. Detang, who produces 9 billion. Again, capacity, economies of scale. They're very crucial partners for capital. And so what this means is that when they're controlling the supply chain, that Arvind is the sole brand for US Polo, UUN is exclusive producer of Nike. What this means is that Nike effectively, it's a kind of buyer-supplier symbiosis. It's no longer buyer-driven. That Nike needs UUN as much as UUN needs Nike, and Arvind needs PVH as much as PVH needs Arvind, and that's why you didn't see them cutting and running, even though it was hurting their bottom line. So organizational fixes. This is a long quote by Marx, where he essentially argues that small capitals turn into larger capitals. Okay. Yeah, so you're seeing a vanishing of smaller capitals, and I went through this. So different reactions to similar phenomena. In China, workers resort to immediately walkout strikes and sometimes riots. In India, workers have responded through existing organizations and trade unions. Whereas, of course, they also resort to strikes as well, but not in the same immediacy, or immediately when the issues arise. Labor protections in India quells the militancy of workers, but also in China, that you have less secure workplaces. I mean, of course, you have less secure and informalized workers here as well, but obviously in export processing-oriented manufacturing, there are a few checks. Not enough, but there are a few more checks. And it reveals a sort of unregulated integrated markets and labor-intensive production process in post-MFA. So I didn't go through the multi-fiber agreement. It's a really important agreement that lasted for 30 years between 1975 and 2005, which meant that you had to actually have a distribution of production around the world. And that gave workers a bit of more negotiating power. Since its phase out in 2005, you've seen the unregulated, so you've seen huge concentrations of capital, which has actually increased the ability for organizational fixes and monopoly capital in the sector, because you've seen huge concentrations in Bangladesh, huge concentrations in India and China, and so that's changing. Again, that's feeding into organizational fixes. Again, another very crucial part is the question of value capture. So here there's a quote from Francine Chen who says, to make demands, historically it's been that workers had to, in the garment sector, were asked to make demands on the brands themselves. Now, obviously there's total spatial disconnection there. I mean, workers are like, how are we going to make demands on these people that are completely disconnected, that we have one shop that are that's producing for a number of brands. There's also so there's a question of power, right? How do you actually exert power, workers' power, on a transnational enemy that is far away? Right now, what you're seeing actually, and workers at Arvind and at UUN felt that way. But now you are having greater negotiating power because you're having greater value capture at the supplier end. Yeah. So historically, historically, you'd have the demands happening totally separate, but now it's kind of, especially in specialized production, it's happening in the Global South. And so here's a number of actions that happened after the UUN strike, whereas historically, by historically I mean in the past 20 years, you'd see actions happening in the Global North only because you'd have retailers at the Global North, the point of consumption at the Global North. Whereas now, because there's shops and retailers, Adidas, because of value capture in the Global South, you're able to target, so they target Hong Kong shop, Taipei, Istanbul, Pochen, in solidarity with workers. I mean, not that you're able to leverage that much power at the point of consumption, but it's an important point of solidarity and solidaristic links. And I'm going to actually, okay, so these are differences, obviously, between the two in terms of comparative research. Obviously, one was a mass strike. The other one was a small-scale violent dispute. There's macroeconomic policy differences, development patterns. But I'm probably best to just end on that because my time is up. Thank you very much.